North Wales. October of 1889, the first sign was not a body nor a cry on the hill, but 3 ewes found standing in a half-circle at dawn on the eastern shoulder of Moel Sych, all facing the same patch of broken turf, as if listening for a sermon beneath the ground. The ground there had fallen in after rain, exposing the stone collar of an old shaft no man in our valley claimed to remember, though the oldest among us spoke of Roman scratchings and later lead men who tunneled where the mountain rang hollow. By noon we had seen marks on the lip of the opening which no sheep had made, and by evening another lamb had gone missing from the Nant Lech grazing. Old Griffith, the former leadman, said quietly that the coblynau had always knocked before taking stock, and that sensible men listened when the mountain began answering itself. I was 29 years of age then, a shepherd born above Llangynog, and I set this down because 4 of us went under that hill before sunrise on the 10th of October, and only 2 came back. What follows is taken first from my own daybook, and where my hand failed, from the pocket journal of Iorwerth Hughes and the memorandum book carried by Dafydd Pugh, who had once worked the old levels when he was young enough to trust timber. If you keep company with such accounts, mark this archive and stay to the end. For the old hills of Wales keep more than weather, and there are many like this laid by in drawers and vestries where no one now thinks to look. And if there is in your own district some tale the elders speak only after dark, leave it with the record beneath this one, because the earth does not always forget what it has once been made to shelter. I had spent all my life among those heights, first at my father's heel, later with my own crook in hand, and there was not a fold from Cwm Raiwarth to the high peat shelves beneath Cadair Berwyn, whose walls and watercourses I did not know by habit better than prayer. Ours was not a rich country, but it was exact. A man knew which gate sagged after wind from the west, which spring stayed sweet in dry August, which patch of bracken hid loose stones that could lame a ewe by noon. At Llangynog the smith mended our buckles, the chapel drew us on Sundays, and at the inn men spoke of prices, weather, and the old mines only when bad ale or deeper dark gave courage to memory. The mountain had been bitten into for centuries. Lead, a little silver, some said copper higher up. Older still were stories of narrow workings no proper company had cut, passages following scenes too mean for profit and too dangerous for wisdom, places where the rocks sweated and the knocks travelled farther than any man's hammer. When I was a boy, my grandmother called such places Twel-y-Nos, holes of the night, and said that what lived long enough without sun no longer wanted its own eyes. She said it, as old women say many things, in the same tone used for weather, taxes, and death. We laughed then, because boys do. We were not laughing in October of 1889. The first losses were simple enough to misread. A lamb unaccounted for in mist, a gate found latched as it had been left, though a ewe was gone from the enclosure, then another, in rough country sheep, vanish. They fall, they wander, they are taken by dogs or men less honest than hunger. What troubled me was the manner of it. There was no torn fleece on fawn, no blooding in the rushes, no drag through the peat. What remained instead were shallow presses in the softened ground, paired and close together, not like hooves, not like boots, and always pointing toward one of the old worked places where the hill had once been opened and then abandoned. On the 4th morning, I found a sheep bell I knew well enough to name, lying in a hollow near the collapsed shaft. Its leather strap had not broken. The brass tongue inside was bent inward, as if struck repeatedly against stone from the wrong side. I brought it down to Nantlet farmhouse and set it on the table between my brother Hugh and old Dafydd Pugh. Hugh turned it over without a word. Dafydd, who had the grey face of a man long acquainted with underground places, did not touch it at all. He only asked where I had found it, and when I told him, he stared toward the window as though the mountain itself had come to stand outside the glass. That evening he spoke more than I had ever heard from him in one sitting. As a youth, he had worked the lower lead levels on the western face, back when small syndicates still hired local men to chase poor veins for poorer return. The deepest galleries, he said, had not all been driven in his day. Some broke into workings older than any company record, passages too narrow in one place and oddly broad in another, with tool marks no miner of his acquaintance could identify. He said the older men had spoken of knocks in the rock that answered no hammer, and of stale air that moved against the face when all shafts on the survey were meant to be dead. No one prosperous believes in mine spirits. Men who have gone hungry underground tend to be less proud. They called the knockers coblynau in those parts, though not kindly, and left scraps of bread or the last of a candle where the tapping was worst. Then he said one thing that made Hugh set down his cup. In the old stories, if the knocks moved upward towards grazing land, the sensible course was not to follow them down, but to move the flock and leave the hill to itself for a season. Hugh asked why. Dafydd answered in the plainest voice imaginable. Because when the hill grows hungry, he said, it first learns the taste of wool. Practical men despise a mystery until it enters their own keeping. By the next day, 3 farms had reported losses, and one of Griffith Evans's collies returned from the high ground before dawn with its muzzle packed in black mud and its eyes so wild it broke from the yard and would not be caught until noon. That same afternoon, a little beyond the place where the shaft had opened, we found a strip of turf peeled back as neatly as old sod lifted for roofing. Though the roots beneath had been torn upward from below, the cavity under it was not natural. One could feel that immediately. The edges had been worn by tools, perhaps very old ones, and from it rose a draught cold enough to sting the gums. We lowered a stone tied to twine and listened. It fell a long while, struck once, then rolled over and over with a hollow ringing that seemed to travel sideways rather than down. Hugh muttered that it must have found some ledge. Griffith, standing apart from us, crossed himself despite never having done such a thing in chapel. We took the matter to Constable Owen in the village, and he gave it the treatment such men always give what they would rather not manage. He wrote down the losses. He suggested thieves. He suggested vagrants. He suggested that autumn weather and mountain fog made fools of judgment. Yet when I asked whether he would care to see the place himself, he cleared his throat and said he had parish business that would keep him below the ridge for the week. It was old Griffith, the former leadman, who gave us the useful intelligence. There had once been an upper adit above the collapsed shaft, hidden now by spoil and bracken, through which men reached a chain of workings not shown on the later company maps because they had passed into unstable ground and yielded little but bad water. The adit, if still open at all, would lie in a shallow scar west of the sheep track, under a shelf of grey limestone streaked white with old mineral runoff. He drew us a map on the back of a seed invoice. Not a proper survey, but enough. Hugh, Yorworth Hughes from COMCRA, Griffith and I agreed to go up before dawn on the 10th, each with a lamp, spare oil, cord and a prayer to whichever power still concerned itself with hillmen. Dafydd Pugh, after a long silence, said he would come too, though his hands had begun to shake whenever talk turned underground. He said one thing before leaving my kitchen that night. If we found the old Roman cuts, we were to mind the side passages more than the main. The hill, he said, hides its oldest mouths off to one side. Rain came hard in the night and ceased just before morning, leaving the mountain washed and shining like black hide under the first poor light. The grass held beads of water so bright they seemed almost white, and every stone sweated. We climbed in silence, each man preserving his own courage by not spending it on speech. At the place Griffith had marked, we found the bracken beaten down in a broad fan, not by wind, but as if many loads had been dragged across it over time. The adit mouth itself was half closed by a slump of spoil and fern roots, yet open enough for a man to stoop through. Water crept from its base in a narrow thread, carrying with it a stink of wet metal. Mold, and something else I could not at first name, because the mind resists putting a human word to an animal absence. It was the smell of a place that had never known daylight and did not want it. Above the adit, in the white run of calcite on the cliff, were fresh scratches laid over very old ones. Not random damage, parallel sets. Close, repeated at different heights, as if made by something ascending and descending the rock face in the dark. Hugh saw them and swore softly. Griffith only took off his cap and wiped his brow, though the air was cold enough for steam. Inside, the first 20 yards were ordinary enough by the standards of abandoned workings. Low roof, dripping walls, rotten timber. Old iron tram plates half sunk in mud. The lamp flames drew thin in places where the air narrowed, then steadied again. Our boots made the same sucking sound every underground place makes when it has been left alone too long. Yet there was a difference in that adit almost at once. No spiderweb crossed it. No rat had nested in the rotting wood. Even the usual molds kept back from certain stones, leaving them clean and pale where nothing healthy should have grown. We came, after a little while, to a junction where the right-hand passage had been crudely blocked with stacked stone and old timbers. The blockage had not failed from age. It had been taken apart and then hurriedly rebuilt more than once. Several beams bore fresh pressure marks, as if leaned against from the far side. Yorworth touched one and snatched back his hand. It trembled under the skin of his fingers like a thing carrying distant knocks. Dafydd said at once that the main run had never needed such a barricade. Not for water, not for foul air, not for subsidence. Griffith asked him what then. Dafydd answered only by kneeling with his lamp near the floor. There, in the black mud beside the wall, was a line of impressions so slight I should never have seen them unprompted, each one shaped almost like the tip of a bare heel pressed by a narrow weight. They went into the blocked passage. None came out. We might have turned back there and spared ourselves most of what followed. But the mountain does a particular work on pride. So does the thought of missing stock and the knowledge that neighbors already look to you for explanation. Men continue not because they are brave, but because too many things become impossible if they admit fear too early. We shifted the first stones from the barrier, then the next, and with each removal the air that seeped through changed. It grew colder, yes, but also older, as though it had lain folded somewhere beyond reach for generations, and now came loose in a long, stale breath. Behind the barricade, the passage narrowed first and then dropped sharply, not by miners cutting, but by some older crack in the mountain that men had later widened to follow. Here the stone changed from the lead level's usual dark wetness to a paler banded rock streaked with white, and the walls were covered not in pick marks, but in innumerable little chips and scores crossing over one another like frantic handwriting. The sound came next. Not a roar, not any dramatic cavern echo of the sort penny stories enjoy. Rather a series of discreet, careful taps from somewhere below and ahead, each separated by enough silence to make the ear lean forward after it. Tap. Then nothing. Then 3 more. Then a dry skittering like loose stones moved by fingers. Griffith whispered that it was the old knocking. Dafydd answered that no pickman ever struck so lightly when he wanted warning understood. The floor dropped us into a chamber higher than the adit and older by every sign. Its roof was ribbed naturally, but the ledges beneath had been cut square in places, as though men long before the mine companies had tried to make store of it. We found rotted wicker there, rusted chain hooks fixed into the stone, and 3 sheep bells half buried in silt, their brass turned black. One still held a shred of leather strap. Another had no tongue left inside. Along the back wall lay a drift of white things that made Hugh halt so suddenly I struck his shoulder. At first I took them for pale spoil or broken calcite, but they were bones, many small, many old, some animal, some not easy to assign in that first frightened glance. I will not dress the sight in language it does not need. It was enough to know that the chamber had been fed in, not once, repeatedly, over years, perhaps longer. Yorworth wanted then to leave, so did I. But in the center of that chamber stood something more terrible than the drift against the wall, because it was new. An iron feeding trough from some surface fold, twisted almost double, its corners scored bright where the rust had been freshly stripped away. How such a weight had come below ground, I cannot say. Only that it had not been there 48 hours earlier, for I knew the trough from Griffith Evans's upper pasture. We argued in whispers, which is the most useless of all human habits, for terror makes no bargain with volume. While we argued, the lamp flame in Griffith's hand flattened sideways. A current moved across the chamber from an opening hidden behind a jut of pale rock at the rear. Not down from above, sideways. The dark there was of a different sort than the rest. Not empty, occupied. Hugh saw it when I did, and lifted his lamp. I wish he had not. What I perceived in that next second, I have had 40 years to reduce to sensible terms, and still I fail. There was movement low to the ground first, too smooth to be scrambling, too deliberate to be a rush. Then another shape behind it, pale as uncured tallow where the lamp caught it, without any shine from an eye, without the lift or turn of a face as human beings expect one another to have. The head, if head it was, kept close to the shoulder, as though the neck had long ago ceased to be useful in a place where nothing need look far. One of them touched the stone with a sound like nails on crockery. Another made the tapping we had heard all morning. Yorworth cried out then, which I do not hold against him, and Griffith lunged to pull him back. The chamber answered at once, knocking from 3 directions. A scatter of stones from the hidden passage. Then a rush of cold so strong both lamps guttered, and one went out completely. In the dark that followed, I heard neither claws, nor snarls, nor any such melodramatic thing. I heard swift, soft impacts, damp skin or cloth striking rock, and Griffith saying the name of God once in a voice so calm it frightened me more than any shout could have done. Then something heavy struck the floor near the trough and slid. Hugh seized my sleeve hard enough to tear it. Dafydd shouted to stay close to the wall. I had a tinder box in my satchel, and I thank Providence that fear, did not make my hands forget it. By the time I coaxed flame to the spare lamp, Griffith was gone from where he had stood, not fallen. Gone. There remained on the mud a broad smeared path, leading behind the pale buttress and a drag upon the wall where something wet had brushed past at speed. We called him twice. No answer came. Only the tapping, now farther in, now on our left, though no passage had shown there before. It is possible the chamber had more mouths than our lamps had found. I believe now it had many. Dafydd did the only sensible thing any of us did that day. He overturned the twisted trough and jammed it against the low opening behind the pale rock, while Hugh and I heaved loose stones under its lip. From beyond it came immediate pressure, not pounding, but a steady, intimate push that made the iron complain. The metal clicked and flexed, as if tested by patient hands. We backed toward the descent, lamps held low. Yorworth had hold of the cord line we had trailed from the barricade, but the line had been cut somewhere behind us. Cleanly, no fray. Clean, the return should have taken minutes. Terror lengthens all distances. On the climb back through the narrow pale passage, Yorworth slipped where the black water crossed the stone. His lamp struck the wall and shattered. Hugh and I each caught one of his arms, but something from the dark below laid hold of his boot with such force that leather tore at the heel. He kicked free once, twice. On the third wrench he was pulled from us, not down the center of the passage, but sideways into a slit in the rock I swear had not been open when we descended. His cap remained in my hand, nothing else. The sound he made was short, astonished, and then cut off as cleanly as a snuffed wick. Dafydd did not stop, nor did Hugh, nor did I. Whatever decencies men owe the lost belong to the daylight world. Underground, debt is measured first to the living. We reached the dismantled barricade to find several of the stones we had stacked outside now moved inward, as if handled from our side by no hand of ours. The main adit beyond it seemed a wide road after what lay below, yet even there the mountain was no longer passive. From the timbers above came tiny siftings of dust, and from some unseen void in the left wall the tapping had resumed, keeping pace with our retreat as neatly as a clerk marking names. When at last the adit mouth showed ahead, washed in that miserable clouded daylight, Hugh uttered a sound I had never heard from a grown man. Across the threshold, in the wet spoil and bracken, lay fresh marks moving both in and out, more of them than I could count with any steadiness. The mountain had not been keeping its traffic wholly beneath, yet the open air, for all its horror, was salvation, and we stumbled into it without dignity, slipping in the spoil, gulping that cold, rain-cleansed air as if we had never before known what air was worth. Behind us, from within the adit, came one final series of knocks, very distinct. 3, then 2, then silence. We descended in a state I can only call altered. Not mad, for madness has its own logic, and we had none. Dafydd stopped twice to retch, though he had eaten almost nothing. Hugh had lost his cap, and one sleeve was ripped to the elbow. I carried Yorworth's notebook, because it had slipped from his coat when we dragged him the first time, and I had thrust it into my satchel without thinking. On the lower slopes we met Griffith Evans and 2 others coming up with ropes, having grown uneasy at our delay. One look at us was enough. They asked where the missing men were. No one answered. Not because words failed us, but because the mountain was still in our ears, and speech seemed suddenly a poor tool beside it. By nightfall, half the valley knew some injury had occurred and embellished it according to appetite. Some said the adit had collapsed on us. Some said tramps had taken refuge there and set upon the party. Constable Owen, forced at last into action by public attention, came to the farmhouse with his ledger and asked questions in the impatient tone of a man already writing his own answer. When we told him plainly that something living was below the old workings, he shut the book and said such statements would only distress the women. Dafydd, who had scarcely spoken since the hill, leaned forward and replied that distress was already in the house and had climbed there under its own strength. The next morning a larger party went up despite everything, not because courage had improved, but because Welsh communities do not abandon their own without at least the form of an attempt. They found the adit precisely where we had left it. They found the scratches in the calcite and the moved stones at the barricade. They found Griffith's cap near the chamber below. They did not find Griffith or Iworth. More than that, they would say only in fragments. One man reported hearing taps from within the wall beside his ear, though the wall there was solid. Another came back with black mud on the knees of his trousers and would never again enter any roofed place without first touching the lintel and listening. By order of the magistrate, and with more haste than care, quarrymen were hired to choke the adit. They tipped spoil, broke down the visible opening, and rolled stone into the collapsed shaft higher on the slope until both places looked as though the mountain had swallowed its own wounds. Dafydd supervised in silence for 1 day only. On the second, he refused to go back, saying the men were sealing the wrong mouths. Asked what he meant, he pointed not at the adit, but at the line of sheep pastures above it, and said, "There were ways up the hill no surveyor had ever seen, because they did not stay in one place for long." Whether the sealing did any good, I cannot firmly say. The losses stopped for a time, that is true. The sheep grazed lower that winter because no man wished to send them back above the blocked workings. Snow came early. Under snow, all country looks innocent. Yet in January, a boy from Penbont claimed he heard knocking under the frozen ground while cutting across a drifted slope. And in February, one of Griffith Evans's ewes was found alive but blind beside a sink in the peat, its eyes clouded white, though no injury marked the sockets. I did not see that animal myself, but the account was repeated by sober men, and I have learned not to discard what several frightened people tell the same way. Dafydd Pugh died in the spring, not from wound or sickness any doctor could name, but from a slow draining away of his sleep and appetite. Before he went, he gave me a wrapped packet containing an old survey sheet and a page torn from a miner's notebook dated 1816. On it was an entry brief enough to freeze the hand holding it. Heard the white stock again in the Roman cut. Lost 2 wethers. Foreman says, seal the side run and keep silence in the valley. There were older references still, if one had the will to hunt them. In a parish memorandum from the previous century, a minister complained of people attributing vanished livestock to subterranean fair folk rather than theft. But appended in another hand, much later, was the remark that certain fissures on the eastern heights should not be reopened during lambing. I found in an estate ledger payment for lime and rubble used to close unsafe ancient hollows after losses among the flocks in 1764. No record explained what sort of unsafety climbs a mountain in the dark and returns what it does not finish. As for Hugh, he married the next year and removed to lower country near Oswestry, where the ground is honest enough to keep its secrets in open clay. He would never again sleep in an upstairs room if rain was falling. He said the knocks came clearer through roofs. Once, years later, after too much cider at a fair, he admitted to me that in the chamber Just before Griffith vanished, he had seen not two pale things in the hidden opening, but many, one behind another, waiting in a stillness more unnatural than attack, waiting to see whether the lamps would fail. I kept the journals because someone had to, and because I could not persuade myself that silence was any safer than memory. In my own notebook for 1893, there is an entry written after a storm in which I rode above the old grazings to inspect boundary damage. The adit we had buried remained buried. The shaft was packed solid. Yet on the slope between them, in fresh, rain-soft mud, I found 3 lines of the same paired impressions crossing the sheep path and vanishing into a crack no wider than a hand at the base of a stone outcrop. The crack had not been there in summer. Perhaps frost had opened it. Perhaps something else had. Time does not diminish a thing of that sort. It merely teaches a man the discipline of carrying it without outward display. I grew older. The valley changed in the usual ways. Young men left for slate or sea. Roofs were relaid. Children were christened. Names disappeared from chapel rolls, and new names replaced them. Yet each autumn, when rain had been long and the sheep pressed higher for rough grazing, some old unease returned to the households nearest the eastern slopes. Doors were checked twice, bells were counted at dusk, and no one with white in his beard willingly crossed Moel Sych after sundown, whatever explanation he offered in company. I have been asked by one man only, and that after many years, what I believe those things to have been. I answer as plainly as I can. I believe they were alive in the ordinary sense, hungry in the ordinary sense, and ancient in a way for which our ordinary speech has little use. Whether they began as beasts and altered in the dark, or as something older that found the minds a convenience, I do not know. The mountain had openings before miners cut it, and miners, as men often do, mistook access for ownership. If a seam of lead drove them into an older habitation, that was not the hill's mistake. The eyelessness troubles listeners most when I speak of it, though I mention it rarely. We place too much dignity in the face. Underground, the face is a luxury. In the deepest cups, there is no horizon to look toward, no sky to read, no need for beauty, expression, or any of the arrangements by which we reassure ourselves that one living thing may understand another. What I saw below, Moel Sych had abandoned all such commerce. It moved by touch, by sound, by memory of passages, by confidence born of a dark home. And because it had no use for eyes, it had no use for pity either. There are nights, even now, as I set down these last notes with old fingers and poorer sight than once I had, when a cart, passing over loose stones outside, will stop my hand, because the pattern of sound is too nearly that measured tapping from below. 3, then 1, then 3 together. Age should make a man less impressionable. In some matters, it does the opposite. The longer one has lived, the more one knows precisely what should not be. I never returned underground after that day. I do not count the ceiling, because one stands in daylight while pretending to govern an opening he fears. I mean, I never again crossed any threshold below the earth by choice. Some men called that cowardice, though not those who had heard the account entire. Let them call it what they like. A sheep that has felt the wall move beside it does not graze the same fold in peace, and a man is only a more talkative animal in that respect. If these journals outlast me, let whoever reads them understand that the danger was not contained in one chamber, one shaft, or one season. It lay in the whole idea that the mountain had been emptied because men had taken ore from it and left their timbers behind. A worked hill is not a finished hill. An abandoned tunnel is not an abandoned road. What lives far below may learn the lines of our walls, the habit of our flocks, the timing of our lamps, and wait with a patience no human trade can match. So I leave this account where sensible men may dismiss it, and careful men may preserve it. If there are others in Wales or Scotland, or any high country where old mines cut through older hollows, let their papers be kept together. Such testimonies are of greater use in company than alone. Subscribe to this archive if you would have more of them brought to light, and leave your own district's buried legends with the record, for the earth keeps a longer memory than any parish clerk. I have only one final caution. When stock vanish on wet high ground, when bells are found bent inward, when a hill begins answering itself with careful little knocks, do not take comfort from daylight, and do not trust any map drawn by human confidence. There are passages older than lead, older than Rome, older perhaps than the names we give our mountains, and in the black behind them, something patient still listens for the sound of wool on stone.